All right. Okay. So yeah, I guess people who don't know, I'm Chris Molyneux, and I've been working as a person-centred counsellor for probably about 10 years now. I think I've been qualified. I had quite an interesting journey to get back to person-centred. So I qualified and trained in person-centred originally. I thought I understood it. I really didn't understand it. And so then I just started like bolting all these different approaches onto it, and kind of realized through that actually I had a lot to learn about the person-centered, and I didn't have a good grasp, and came right back full circle. And in a way just ended up teaching myself again to get the real fundamentals and the principles. So yeah, that was about 10 years ago. I was working as a lecturer and in private practice and in a college in Preston. Moved down here 5 years ago and set up private practice. Was teaching at a college for a few years, and we've just set up a person-centered training centre in Brighton, which we're going into our second year. It's been received really great. I think there's a lot of kind of restraints of delivering counselling training within a college, within a different educational setting. And I think it misses a lot of the things that are really important in training. So myself and my friend wanted to set up a kind of independent centre so we could really deliver it how we wanted and have a kind of different ethos and different values. And yeah, it's going great. It's such a pleasure to do. And I love that work because to be involved with the students just keeps me asking the questions and keeps me having those debates as well. So I value that so much. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment, is training and working in private practice and doing supervision. So
that's
yeah,
great, Chris.
that's a bit of me.
Yeah, so my name is Mick Cooper. I teach counselling psychology counselling at the University of Roehampton in South London. I started my training initially was in existential therapy, but then I worked a lot in the person-centred field with Dave Means up in Strathclyde, and then kind of came back. I got more involved in counselling psychology, which kind of by definition actually is a integrative approach. As a counselling psychologist, you kind of need to, there's an expectation that you'll have skills and at least two approaches. So it kind of maybe contrasts with counselling. And I guess, what was it, about 15 years ago, with John McLeod started developing this idea of pluralism, which is, so we're kind of coming from different directions, aren't we, Chris? And that came out of a kind of, I guess, person-centered values, and thinking about person-centered values and what person-centered meant was where pluralism came from. But there's been, I guess, it's been quite controversial and surprisingly controversial. I think, disappointingly, I think I'm not disappointed that there's discussion. I thought that people in the person-centered community would be more embracing of what John and I were trying to do with pluralism, what other people are trying to do. And I guess part the reason is we wanted to have a dialogue, Chris, was to kind of talk through some of these issues, and particularly around the kind of, I guess we both feel that some of the core issues are around the idea of the actualizing tendency, and what we mean by the actualizing tendency, how we understand it, and then what that says in terms of how we practice and the kind of integrity of our practice versus diversity. And it's very interesting what you're saying about, kind of feeling that you were bolting on loads of stuff. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a lot of areas of agreement between us, aren't there? I mean, probably the first area of agreement is that whatever you do as a therapist, you've got to be trained in, skilled in.
Absolutely.
Neither of us would want to be talking about people just kind of taking things willy-nilly and just doing whatever they feel like at the time. I remember seeing a therapist once who kind of said one session, he said, "Oh, I've been in a workshop this weekend and we did X, Y, and Z, and let's do that." I was like, God, is that all you know, that you've just done it once and you want to bring it in? So I guess the word is syncretism, I think, is the technical word for just like shaking lots of things together. But I guess the issue is around, maybe, I don't know, what would you say, Chris? Is it about about whether person-centered practice should be pure, or whether it's okay to bring in other stuff? Do you think that's the core issue?
It might be, yeah. I think the actualizing tendency is probably going to have a lot of answers for us, because for me, I guess the difference that I see about person-centered counselling is I personally see it as a philosophy, rather than just an approach. And so for me, sometimes the debates about kind of efficacy and things like that can sometimes miss the point of what that's about. Although I practice in a purely person-centered way and that fits for me, I'm absolutely not of the mindset that that should be the only way. I really don't believe that. I think it's so important for therapists to find approaches which fit with them, because I think if you hold the kind of underlying philosophical beliefs very well, and you know that well for yourself, I think that fundamentally changes how you offer it to the client and the robustness of what you're offering as well. So I guess that's one thing to say, is I'm not coming from an angle of like person-centered is good for everyone, that's all we should be, because clients need different things, you know, and I'm sure you'll be the first to agree that with pluralism as well. I think the thing for me is when we start adding other things on, what that does to the philosophical belief around person-centered counselling. So the article I was talking about before that was in Therapy Today, the kind of analogy I gave, which obviously has some holes in it, but is around, it's kind of like a vegetarian saying I eat meat. You know, is that the very practice of doing that goes against the philosophy you're meant to hold.
You're talking to a vegetarian that eats meat.
Okay, there you go. Oh, okay. Maybe very fitting. And for me, that's not to say you are no longer a vegetarian, but there is something in the deeply held philosophy that is then, in a sense, contradicted by the action. And I see person-centered quite similar to that, is if we're saying I will occasionally use CBT, what does that say about your belief about person-centered, your belief about the actualizing tendency, and can that then still be referred to as person-centered?
See, what worries me about that, Chris, and I do really take your point, but for me, what worries about it from a person-centered standpoint is it feels very therapist-centered.
Right,
So
yes.
it feels like seeing, you know, we think about therapy, we can see it from the therapist angle, or we can see it from the client angle.
Yes.
And obviously we're going to be inclined to see it from the therapist angle, and our training is about modalities and philosophies and kind of particular, you know, practices where we see things as non-directive, and directive is very different. But this comes from my, you know, I started off very committed to the person-centered approach, and I was very against kind of mixing stuff, you know, years back. And as I said, we kind of gone in different directions. I think what changed me was really seeing the research and listening to clients, because like when I started listening to clients talking about therapy, they just didn't say things like, well, what was really helpful was that the therapist had a coherent philosophy.
Absolutely.
Or that you know, that they stuck to a purist person-centered approach. I mean, just to give you an example, so we've recently done some research from a big study of kids in schools, who over 50 kids, quality interviews, in-depth interviews. What did they find helpful with person-centered counsellors, and with person-centered counsellors who were kind of audited and checked and were practicing, very experienced, skilled person-centered counsellors. And the two things that came up as most helpful for their kids, that they said, the first one was about being listened to, and that they really valued being listened to, and that they felt really heard, and that having that chance to talk about things was really important. But then the second thing that they talked about was about advice. I mean, they said, and this was person-centered counselors, they said it was really valuable that the therapist gave me some advice and gave me some guidance, and that was particularly around things like coping skills. So like how to deal with anxiety, you know, stresses. And then it was also even more so about interpersonal relationships. So it was things like, you know, it was really helpful when the counsellor said, you know, just ignore the bullies, or why don't you talk to your mum about that? Now, I'm sure some of that was, you know, some of the work we're doing is kind of looking what actually happened there, because I'm sure part of that was reflections that the kids in there, you know, understood as advice. But sometimes they were talking things like, you know, where the counsellor said, I should go and talk to so-and-so, or they suggested this mindful, which clearly had come from the counsellor. But I think the point is that they valued that, and they didn't say, well, I really like the listening, but I didn't like the advice. They said, you know, for them, there wasn't that kind of distinction between these two that I think that as counsellors we've learned to make. So for me, it feels, this idea that you have to have a coherent philosophy, that, as I say, it feels very therapist centered to me rather than client centered.
Yeah, I can totally agree with that. And I think for me, in saying about that, it is therapist centered, because I guess I'm just saying I know where I am in that. And it's like, this is what I feel I can offer very well, and that I feel I have a good understanding, and it will be a kind of consistent space that I can offer. That isn't to say that it's like I'm going to, lock clients in the room and say, right, this is what you're getting and that's it, So in me saying that for myself, it's not saying, and so therefore every client who comes to see me has to have that. I think there is something for me that if it doesn't fit, then you can, refer on, look at someone else if it's not a good fit for them. So I think it's like anything else, if you go to a certain shop to get a particular product, there's other products you're going to get from other shops. So I do get that it's therapist centered, and I guess as I was talking about it then, it was for me as well. There's some really interesting, I think, the philosophical elements again that might be worth coming back to later around that process of a therapist giving you some advice. What does that do in terms of non-directivity, empowerment, the therapist power element as well. I think there's all those areas that are really important in that. But just to go back to the main point that you were saying there, I agree with that, that clients are going to want different things, and part of the therapist's job is to help them find that.
But I think, yeah, I mean, for me, pluralism, sorry to interrupt, Chris, but I think for me, pluralism evolved because it was about trying to get away from that kind of therapist-centered way of thinking about therapy, and actually trying to kind of see therapy from the standpoint of the client. So I see I understand what you're saying, in the sense of, in a way you have to be therapist-centered because it is about you, isn't it? And there's something about congruence that you can't completely just lose yourself in the world of the client. And yet, I guess for me, client, and I think, I mean, politically, I'm sure we come from a similar place about wanting to empower clients, and really wanting to hear the voice of clients. But for me, that does mean trying to really think about, as clients, how are they seeing the therapy? What is it that they're wanting? What is their experiencing of different elements of that? And you're right. I mean, I can only offer certain things, and part of it is about being clear about what it is that I can offer. I mean, do you think that, I mean, you're saying, Chris, that you for you personally, working in a kind of purist, if you like, person-centered way is what fits for you, and what suits you. Do you think if somebody feels that what works for them and what sits for them is using person-centered, some CBT, some psychoeducation, maybe some, confidence building or assertiveness skills, are you okay with that, or do you think that's a problem?
Yeah, I think it's a very tricky area, because for me, I'm kind of caught between this idea of, I really want to respect what the client wants in that space and to meet that where I can. The problem I find with that is, as if we go back to what we were saying about the idea of empowerment, is it could potentially risk that empowerment as well. Because I know, for example, I think we talked in our emails a bit around something like anxiety. I would say 95% of the people that come to see me about anxiety will just want it taken away, will want some coping strategies. And again, maybe, I don't know, 60% of those 2 years down the line have realized it's something completely different, and through exploring that, the anxiety as a kind of side effect has reduced significantly. So there's this difficult area in the example you give there of, I really do want to respect the client's wishes, but it's also holding that power balance as well and wanting to do that, because we can't ultimately give clients everything they want. Every client would want a magic wand that just says, okay, we've got rid of everything that you're struggling with. So yeah, I can't give, I guess, a very clear answer to that, because it feels such a tricky area.
It is a tricky area.
Because it's not just about giving those things. For me, it's about what does it mean to give those things as well, which is such an important part. And just to finish that off, I think for me, that's why it's different with person-centered, in that a lot of the things that we might bring into the work has, in my eyes, a higher risk of clashing with the fundamental philosophy of it. I could see how other approaches you could integrate and mix, and actually it would be consistent. But for me, if it's like, I want to offer a non-directive space which respects, you know, your power, and is that kind of counter conditioning, which I think is super important in all of this, that anything I bring in from my frame of reference or give to you as a client could potentially, not always, but could potentially risk that idea of the kind of philosophy that we're holding within that.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting at some point to kind of maybe Chris to say a bit more about that philosophy and what our kind of philosophical assumptions are. But
Yes, yeah.
see, I think there's something about kind of levels. Something I've been thinking recently is about levels of, you know, like when we say trusting the client, which I think
Yes.
we both would see as being essential to our work and our values and what it means to be person-centered. But, you know, when you talk about trusting the client, like trusting what? Because as you're saying, that there's kind of different levels, there's different manifestation. You know, the client is not necessarily a coherent thing. I mean, you know,
Yes,
go back to
right.
Rogers, they're in a state of vulnerability. There's some fragmentation there, as there is with all of us.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about, but particularly when we talk about trusting the client, are we talking about trusting that in their being, in the here and now, their kind of conscious sense of what they want and what they need is trustworthy? Or are we saying that there's some kind of deeper inner core of something that knows, perhaps unconsciously, where it is the person needs to go? And that when we talk about trusting, that's what we're trusting, rather than perhaps what their immediate conscious thing is. And I think probably the difference between maybe a pluralistic and a more classical reading of person-centered therapy is, I think pluralistic does emphasize more the kind of conscious, not external, but kind of here and now, where the client is, rather than kind of hypothesizing or seeing some kind of deeper core that is maybe pulling against where the person is in the here and now. And just say a bit more about that. I mean, obviously all these things come back to our own experiences and our own perceptions. Right. And I think for me, John Norcross and I were doing some work on client preferences, and we were talking about we were doing a presentation, and we were talking about, you know, as a client, what is it that you hate most? You know, and what you know, it's a great exercise for therapists. Like, what, you know, when you're a client, what do you hate? And when I think about that, what I hate, actually, what I hate in life, I'm a younger brother, so what I hate more than anything else is people telling me that they know better than me what I want.
Yeah,
you know, and Lang writes about that as the kind of source of driving people mad, and it certainly has driven me mad in my life and in my therapy. Somebody saying, well, you say that, you know, you say that's what you want, but really, you know, deep down, what I think I mean, that just fucking drives me crazy.
It's that. Like, I know better than you.
Yeah, I know better than you. And for me, there's something about that kind of, you know, more kind of, I don't know, core, that belief that there's a core. Like, I feel like if I go to a client and I say, you know, like, how would you like this to work? Right. So, and the client is saying, you know, I want some coping skills.
Yes.
If I'm approaching that client thinking, oh, well, you see, you think you want some coping skills.
I'm with you. Yeah.
But really, I know that what you need is a non-directive space to grow and evolve and develop, and that you'll realize that actually you don't need coping skills. For me, that feels paradoxically like really holding an expert position.
I get that.
And it doesn't feel person-centered. It feels like I'm kind of saying, you think you know what you want, but really I know better than you what you want.
I get you. Yeah.
And irrespective of what you're saying, I'm going to do what I think, you know, going back to being therapy-centered, I'm going to do what I think is better for you. But at the same time, I mean, there, you know, it would be naive and it would be counter to the evidence to say that clients always know what they want. And certainly the research shows that you know, what people think they want and what people may want at a deeper level is different. Yeah. So, you know, I think pluralism and it isn't therefore just doing, as you say, just doing what somebody wants. We can't always do what we want. We got skills, we got knowledge. So it is a tricky area. I think for me, what we try and do in pluralism then is not just kind of say to the client, what do you want, and do it, but it's about opening up a dialogue and having that dialogue, having that exchange, asking clients about their preferences, and if they haven't got any, kind of moving on, and if they do, then talking about it, and trying to find a way of using dialogue as a way of both respecting where a client is at the beginning, but also then allowing for something deeper to emerge, so that we kind of hold both of those things as kind of trustworthy.
Yeah. I think to just go back a bit to that is that, the impression I don't want to give is that it would be, that preference would be dismissed. It wouldn't be like, oh, you want coping strategies, but actually they're a waste of time. Let me tell you what's going to help you. Absolutely wouldn't be that way. But I think what is important is how we respond to that. So if we were to look at the necessary and sufficient conditions, then you would say that, empathy, acceptance, and congruence within the therapist would be enough in response to that. So for me, there's almost like a bit of a fork in the road there of when we hear a client say, I'm really struggling with this anxiety, I just wish there was something that could take it away. Do we respond from a place of, oh, well, I'm glad you said that because these things have proven to help? Or do we say, this is really getting unbearable for you and you just want it gone, or something similar? So for me, again, I think this is where it comes back to that philosophical stance underneath it, because it's kind of informing every response we give. And I don't think that's just as simple as empathic responses or something like that, but it's how do we hear what the client is saying to us? And I think our approach then gives us that framework. You talked before about fragmentation, that the client is, likely in a state of incongruence. And so if we're holding that in how we're hearing the client, I think that informs how we respond to it as well. Rather than just being, actually, this isn't going to be helpful for you, person-centered is the way. It's actually more about how we hear and respond, which I think is really crucial.
I mean, you were talking, about philosophy. I guess my philosophy is I mean, the most influential philosopher was Buber.
Okay.
And I think that his work, particularly around dialogue. So I think I kind of see truth as lying in, truth, for want of a better word, is lying in dialogue in the in-between. And I think there's probably some differences there with the classical client-centered position, which would see more the truth as lying within the client. I kind of hold that more relational stance. So for me, going back to that very practical example that you give, Chris, I agree with you. Their client comes in and says, like, I'm really anxious, I want coping skills. Exploring what that means and how that is for the client and what they're asking for and what they understand by coping. I think those things are really important, not just going, right, well, I've got that. I as you were saying before, that I think that could be very disempowering for a client. But I think that maybe the difference between us, I don't know. Well, it'd be interesting to hear from you. But for me, if I have some ideas about coping skills, maybe relaxation exercises, maybe breathing exercises. And if I'm working with a client and through dialogue, I get a sense that, for instance, they're really kind of tense and it's very in their body, then I might and I might say to them something like, would be helpful for us to think about some breathing exercises here, and then I might bring that in. If a client is having panic attacks, and I might bring in some psychoeducation at some point, not straight away. I mean, not like at first, client says I'm having panic attacks. I say, well, the thing about panic attacks is but I would at some point, quite possibly, if it seemed like a client thought it was going to be helpful, bring in some knowledge and information about, like that panic cycle, for instance, and how panic, because my experience, I mean, I do a lot of evaluation of my work, and we look at what clients at the end say is helpful, and I think clients do often say that those kind of things are really helpful to know, but, and not kind of straight off the bat. It feels to me, I guess, it feels like it's not an either or. It feels like we can do that person-centered, empathic, and that depth of understanding is really important. I think we would both say that. I guess maybe where we differ is that I kind of feel that there's things that can be helpful. So in terms of that kind of necessary and sufficient, I mean, my problem with that statement, and I don't think it's a helpful statement, actually. I don't agree with it, that those core conditions and the 6 conditions are necessary and sufficient. The problem for me about it, more than anything else, is it's just a very overgeneralized statement of what is true for all clients. And I think clients are different. I think for some clients, that relational, those core conditions can be incredibly helpful, can be life transforming, deeply changing. But I think for other clients, there's other ways of helping that they might need more than that, and that's okay. And what worries me, Chris, is that in the same way that it worries you probably that people are just kind of bolting stuff onto person-centered, and I know other people like Janet Tolan and have the same concerns, and I agree with that. But I think what worries me is that sometimes people come out of person-centered trainings feeling really straitjacketed, and feeling like there's this kind of person-centered police around them that's going to kind of bash them at the moment they ask a question or they make a suggestion. And I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's helpful for them in terms of being themselves as a therapist. And I don't think that that's necessarily helpful for clients. If you've got a client who's wanting to learn about coping skills and you've got a therapist who has some ideas, then I think they should feel that they can be creative and grow and evolve as a practitioner in terms of being able to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I really don't want it to seem that I'm coming from the standpoint that I would never offer something like that. If a client is asking me a question directly and I have something which meets that, I'm going to answer that request. So I don't want it to be like I'm just saying, I'm not ever going to engage with that. But I agree with you. I think this could be a whole other debate, but I think the person-centered stuff about the training, I think there's a real in my experience anyway, a real lack of quality in person-centered training a lot of the time. I've, heard of students coming out of college, never having been taught about the actualizing tendency, never being taught about the underlying philosophy. And so I think that can actually lead to the straitjacketing when there's a misunderstanding, because it's like, okay, all I need to do is offer the core conditions. That's what person-centered counselling is. And I think restriction comes with a lack of understanding. I know for myself, like the more I learn about it, the more freedom I actually feel that I have within that, and how the kind of core conditions can be embodied in lots of different things. It's kind of not what you do, it's the way that you do it, is almost how I see it. But I think, like I say, that could be a whole other debate, but I think that's a lack of understanding or training that often comes from.
Chris. But what would you? I'd be interested to know a bit more about them. What do you see as? I mean, what do you see as the kind of core for you? What is the essence? What's the core philosophy?
So for me, it has to begin with the actualizing tendency.
What do you mean by that, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. So for me, it is a belief, and again, I think it's philosophical. It's a belief that there is a kind of motivational force in all living things. I think we could say. I think it's maybe even easier to see in nature than it is in people, and I think it gets a lot more complicated in people because of society and conditioning and all of that stuff. But for me, that is the starting point. I know in our course, it's the first thing we teach, because it's like, if you get this and you agree with it, and there is room to disagree with it, I just want to make sure that that's emphasized. But it's like, if you get the actualizing tendency, for me personally, and I think in the theory, the next step is then, okay, what is the best we can offer for the actualizing tendency? Okay. So so that's what
before we go on to that, like, so you say it's a motivational force.
Yes.
So okay, so it's an inner motivation. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's like a directional force.
Okay. So in a but in a direction towards what?
Well, yeah, this is where it gets complicated then. And going back to what you're saying about the fragmentation, is that the actualizing tendency is going to be alive in both the self-concept and the organismic valuing process. So, and therefore, with the theory, this is what causes the conflict. And for me, that explains, a lot of the criticism that can come from person-centered is, well, why do people still do bad things? And for me, that is very simply answered in the theory, and I think this is something we spoke about and agreed with, is that actualizing tendency is going to be driving the self-concept, which could, be societally bad behaviors might be seen, or even destructive behaviors. But for me, it doesn't take away from its presence. It almost proves it even more. Is like, why are we doing that? Why are we driven to those things if from the outside it seems to be doing us harm? So for me, it speaks of something in each person where it isn't just a homeostasis. It isn't just, if that wasn't present, then maybe we would just live on, I think it's impossible in society, but just on this plateau constantly. And actually what we see, or at least what I see, is that people aren't doing that. They're wanting to change, they're wanting to improve however they see that improvement. So for me, it's like there's a clear sign there's something driving us there. Even the process of just going to therapy says, this is how I feel, I want to feel different, is saying that I'm not okay with this, there's something in me that is seeking. So for me, it's just fundamental, and I think for myself, unquestionable part that is
so
present.
is a kind of inner driving force towards, I guess, as Rogers would say, self-enhancement and self-maintenance. Yeah.
Yes, although that can get tricky. I think we probably both understand that, but that self-enhancement can get tricky, because I know people, again, this argument of like, well, why are they doing that? Because it doesn't look self-enhancing. But
Yeah.
we're making all these choices in the environment that we're in, and with all the conditions that have been put on us.
Trying to do, I guess I would understand it as trying to do the best that we can.
Yes.
Whatever this
Yeah.
is. But then, so I mean, so how do you answer, like, because for me, what's been very important has been, like, so feminist, cross-cultural, kind of post-colonial theories, postmodern theories that would say that, the kind of this idea of a kind of inner core, an inner drive that kind of exists prior to socialization, prior to relationship, prior to culturalization, is more a kind of Western male fantasy.
Okay.
Emerging from Rogers' New Deal America, the plains drifter, go for it, kind of mindset, than a kind of, if we stand back from that and if we take a kind of more critical cultural perspective, queer theory and, a whole range of other theories that today I think would argue that our being, even going back to Heidegger, our being is not some kind of individualized, isolated, autonomous self.
Okay.
That, whatever we mean by so, even organism, that we are, from a postmodern standpoint or a relational standpoint, I mean, Buber would argue that we are always fundamentally in relation.
I agree.
And, as something like Bowlby might say with attachment theory, or Winnicott, that you have people who are in relation and that we're always part of communities, we're almost part of dyads, we're almost part of worlds. And there's all these different kind of levels of relationality that Rogers's idea of the kind of solipsistic isolated self is just one version that is part of a particular patriarchal, white agenda. And I think for me that's important. I mean, I certainly take those critiques very seriously. And I think what they mean in practice for me is that, if we hold this idea that there is this kind of singular self that evolves like a kind of separate plant, then our role as a therapist is kind of nurture it, stand back, allow it to emerge, provide that non-directive space. But I think if we take a more dialogical, relational standpoint, then there is perhaps more of an intrinsic, we can never not be like I would question, Chris, whether we can ever really be non-directive. I think two people in a room are always going to influence each other, are always going to have a presence, and not in the sense of kind of, you have two separate selves that then come together, but we are fundamentally, from Heidegger, beings in the world. We are fundamentally opennesses and our language that we speak is all about kind of being in relation to each other.
I get that. Yeah.
And so, you know, this idea of an actualizing tendency, I mean, I agree we have the kind of directions, but it's always diffuse. What do you think of these feminist critiques? Do you think they're just nonsense?
No. I think I'm agreeing with what you're saying. I guess what I'm struggling to understand is I don't see that being counter to what's being said there. So I don't think I'm seeing the actualizing tendency as solely in a vacuum in the individual, because the individual exists in community, and that then will be part of that process. So, you know, if it was completely individual, maybe that would look like, what do I want? I'm just going to do that, you know, and I don't care about anything else. But for me, that isn't the process of therapy. It isn't the process of actualization. It's actually, I don't know, I'm really struggling with this friend, and I really want to tell them they're annoying me, but I'm scared of conflict, for example, you know. So for me, I don't really see a problem there, because I don't think I see it as the individual in a vacuum. It's the individual in community. And so the actualizing tendency is part of that. And the very fact we have a lot of difficulties is because of relationship. And again, it goes back to that idea of counter conditioning, is actually we're kind of freeing that space a little bit more, so we can be ourselves, can be more congruent within community and within society. You know, nearly all of the issues that people are exploring are in relationship. So I guess I see it as integrated with that. I guess I don't hear it
Yeah,
as a
I guess
problem, you know.
I think it's a bit of a kind of ontological, it's a difference at an ontological level about,
Okay.
I mean, I think there's an idea that we have people and then they come into relationships, and kind of Rogers's model is that we have people come into the world as individuals,
Right.
and then they relate. And then, you know, as you say, there's problems in relationship. And in Rogers's model, the very most fundamental problems are when you know, people are influenced by each other. But I think if you look at someone like Bowlby or Buber or kind of more postmodern theories, they would question this idea that the individual precedes the relationship.
Okay.
They would say that we start as an openness, as a relationship, as a kind of being, as these kind of vessels through which multiple discourses speak, if you take a kind of postmodern standpoint. And I think where the importance is, kind of in terms of practice, is that, I mean, you talk about providing a non-directive space for clients, and that's really important for you in your work, is providing a non-directive space. But for me, that's kind of based on this idea that there is this thing in the client that if you provide a non-directive space, you know, like the kind of plant on a windowsill I'm looking at as I talk, you know, can kind of evolve and grow. And I love that, you know, it's a beautiful metaphor, and I love it, Chris, and, you know, that idea of the tree. But I guess the other way of looking at it is that the client is is a relational being, and comes into relational space. That although, you know, and that non-directive space, rather than that being some kind of pure non-directivity, actually that's a particular stance. That's a particular way of having a dialogue with someone that isn't actually neutral, but is a dialogical position, as there are other dialogical positions. And why is that important? That's important, I think, because it kind of dissolves a bit this idea of this distinction between kind of non-directivity and directivity. Because if you sit there, for instance, quietly or you know, and listening to someone, that has an influence. If you offer advice, that has an influence.
Totally.
If you suggest, like, you know, all these different ways, we're always influencing each other. So we can never, you know, and again, that's what we've kind of seen in our research. I mean, we saw young people, for instance, when we asked them about what they didn't like about the person-centered therapy, about 20% or so said that they found the silences really awkward. And some found it so uncomfortable that they, you know, wanted to drop out or ended up staying there just because they didn't want to upset the therapist.
Absolutely.
You know, I don't think they experienced it as what we might have thought, or what the therapist thought was being non-directive. That actually the clients could still experience that as a very powerful interaction. So I guess what I'm kind of trying to say, Chris, and sorry, I'm not very clear here, but
no, it's okay.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, all the time, me and you, the people listening to this, we're all in this kind of constantly evolving, mixed interrelational space that we're always kind of
Yes.
moving around in. And I guess I don't see, and going back to our earlier discussion about how clients see the world, like as clients see it, I don't see these kind of distinctions between this kind of purism and non-directivity versus a kind of mixed, more integrate. Because I think it's always integrate. I think it's always
Yes.
messy, and that's
Yeah.
pluralism is messy. I know, and it's not as neat as this idea of kind of plant growing and evolving and being nurtured by the water. That's lovely.
But it,
Pluralism is more like this kind of messy room that you're
right. Yeah.
constantly having to clear up. Nobody wants that. I just think that's the reality, that things are messier.
Yeah, and I think that is a romantic view. That isn't, how it works often with clients. Is they aren't the plant that you just plant and then over, 6 months they turn into this wonderful thing. Sometimes maybe, but usually it's via a lot of distress, a lot of experimenting, a lot of messiness. So yeah, I think it can look very different to that. But I think the thing that comes up for me in what you were saying there, I think there can be a danger as seeing non-directivity as passivity. And I think that's a massive, again, can be a misunderstanding for people in that. When I talk about for myself non-directivity, I'm thinking more of that, the kind of Barry Grant principled and instrumental. That for me is what I talk about with non-directivity. The kind of principled non-directivity is actually out of a deep respect for the client and could look and is sometimes extremely active and extremely involved, whereas the instrumental side is trying to do something, try to do it to achieve something. So I guess for me, when I talk about non-directivity, it's not that I am in a sense literally standing out the way and just saying, you've got this, I'm just going to sit here and observe it. It's saying that I really want to respect your personhood, I really want to respect your humanity and the ways that goes, even if it's destructive, even if I have a different view on what I would do for myself. So I think that's an important aspect of it, that yeah, the non-directivity is not passivity, and it's even not trying to achieve something per se. It's just saying, yeah, I trust you, I respect you, and even though it's non-directive, let's do this together, in a sense.
I think that's a really, really important point, Chris, and it is often a misunderstanding of person-centered,
Absolutely.
that it's passive. So what does non-direct? Do you like the word non-directivity?
I think so. Yeah, I think that I've become more and more kind of attached, I think, to that clarification of the principled non-directivity, because I think if we just say non-directivity, I think it can lead to complication and misunderstanding, and it can almost start going down that path where people say, well, I'm person-centered because I do whatever the client wants, and again, I think that's a huge misunderstanding.
So what does it mean to you to be non-directive?
I think similar to what I was just saying before, is something about it's grounded in respect for the person. And I think I mentioned it before, but I think that also begins to touch on something around power, is if I exert any kind of power, and I think maybe that's impossible because there's going to be power in there, but let's just say best intention. If I exert power or knowing or expertise over you, there is, I think, a high risk that I disrespect your humanity and your capability. It's like what you were saying a bit ago about this idea of I know better than you. Ultimately, what you really want is da 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 da. So for me, non-directivity is pretty much respect. I think that's almost a better word for it in a sense,
So I think that there's points there that we both really agree on and really I would disagree on.
Okay.
I mean, if you define non-directivity as kind of respect and valuing of the client,
Yeah.
then absolutely. And I think, when we developed pluralism, that was the kind of quest in a way, was to can we engage with clients in the most respectful and valuing ways.
Yes.
And so I think we really share that that there's an ethics perhaps before anything is about how do we really respect and value one. But I think when you talk about power, see, that's where I go back to that kind of more postmodern relational critique, that I think there's a really important point that there is always power. And I think it's a bit of a, I don't know, misnomer or a myth, the idea that kind of person-centered reflective practices are necessarily more empowering and respectful than, say, CBT. Like because I mean, you know, if you look at the evidence, clients can find learning coping skills, learning relational skills really, really empowering, really respectful, and equally they can experience reflection, kind of empathic summaries as actually quite disempowering and not particularly helpful. So, you know, if we start from that position of saying, like, you know, the ways that what's most fundamental to both of us is wanting to engage with clients in respectful and valuing ways, where that takes me is towards integration. It's towards feeling, well, different clients are going to want different things at different points in time, and I really need to be open to you know, those differences, and kind of recognize that there's lots and lots of different ways of doing that. And I don't know a priori what is going to be the most effective way of being empowering, whether it's going to be through empathy, whether it's going to through psychoeducation, whether through help. And I think that, you know, that was partly really looking at the evidence. I mean, I would have agreed with you, Chris, 20 years ago, that, you know, offering advice and suggestions and guidance is likely to be more disempowering. But actually, just looking at the evidence, just looking at what's clients say, I can't say that anymore, just because that's not what I see in the evidence. I see clients saying, actually, was, you know, my clients, when I look at their evaluations, clients more generally, saying that, you know, those things were actually really helpful. You know, I mean, Rogers in the 30s and 40s, when he developed person-centered therapy, non-directive therapy, it was a reaction against very kind of paternalistic, kind of advice-led forms of consultation that I think you could clearly see were disempowering, and that he wanted to do something different. He wanted to respond to that. But I think, you know, there's a danger, I guess, that it goes so far one way that actually in our kind of contemporary world, I think people can maybe experience things differently. And I think there's a way, like with some CBT practitioners, where you're warm, you're friendly, but you're also offering structure and advice that can be, I think, really empowering, and people can experience that as really empowering. Now, that's not, sorry, last thing, but that's not to say that that's what everyone should do. I mean, I really respect what you're saying, Chris, about, you know, you're saying that for you, you want to be, you know, work in this person-centered way. And you know, that's what you're offering. And I think it's really important that people, you know, feel that they can offer what it is that they want to offer, and don't feel that they have to be integrative. I mean, you know, a client might come to you and want CBT, and you would say, I'm sorry, you know, I really respect that, but that's not what I can offer. So it's not about that. But I think pluralism is about just trying to be open to that diversity, and that there isn't kind of like, there's not one right way. We agree on that, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do agree on that. Yeah, I think that's the thing where it can maybe get complicated sometimes in the discussion of this, is that it isn't that I'm saying pluralism is wrong. It isn't saying that I'm saying different therapies are wrong, even that integration is wrong. So that isn't the place I'm coming from. I agree with, you know, pretty much all the points that you're saying about the approach and the reasons behind it. I think for myself, just because of I guess maybe my own journey, my own beliefs and things like that, is something about valuing, maybe even protecting the person-centered approach, and also ensuring correct understanding of it. I think my experience has been the majority of people actually misunderstand it rather than understand it. And I think that's more what my intention is with this, is not to say, I think, as I said right at the beginning, for me, this debate is not about efficacy. It's about philosophy. So I would agree with, you know, everything that you're saying, but I might say yes, but that I wouldn't say that's person-centered, if that makes sense. So it's not a case of there is a right way to practice. Why isn't everyone doing this? But actually just really knowing and being grounded in what you are doing, and what your intention and belief is behind that. And just quickly to go back to what you said about the straitjacket a bit ago, I think that's when that comes about, when it's almost doing things as a kind of methodology, because that's what I'm meant to do, rather than really taking time to say, what do I believe about humans, you know, and what do I want to offer to people in what I'm doing, rather than, okay, on the course they said I can never ask questions, so I'll just stick to that without questioning it. Yeah, so that's kind of more the direction I'm coming
that's
from.
really clear. So I mean, I'm aware we're kind of coming up to time, but I'd really like to know, Chris, like for you, you know, if you were going to summarize for people what person-centered means to you, because I mean, I really respect what you're saying about kind of wanting to protect that and just the importance of people knowing that. How would you describe what person-centered is?
Oh, that's a big question. I think to go back a bit to what I was saying before, I think it has to start, and I think with any approach, actually, I think it has to start with us looking inside ourselves, actually, to think about what do we believe about people? Do we believe that there is, one philosophy that fits all? Do we think it's different for each? And so for me, my process in that is grounded in the actualizing tendency and that philosophy. So in terms of what I mean about person-centered, that for me has to be the starting point. Is the first question is, do I believe in the actualizing tendency? And if I do, is it all the time with all people, or is it certain situations? And
So would you say that to be person-centered, you have to believe that that's true for all people at all times?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think necessarily. Because I wonder if people could believe it for most people most of the time. I don't know. This is actually like a new thing to think about for me, so I probably can't give a clear answer for that. I guess, yeah, that's what it was for me. There's something about all the people all the time which I think certainty worries me a little bit, to say this for everyone always, because then you start to get into cultural aspects of that, and how that manifests in relation to it. How does that impact it? Even things like gender, race, you can get loads of stuff there. So I don't think I like anything which is all the time for all the people. So but for me,
there's something, Chris, about what you're saying is at the core of it is this belief in the actualizing tendency. And then in terms of practice, what do you think, how would you describe what is person-centered practice?
Okay, yeah, I think it is. This feels like I'm avoiding this, but I do. It does feel individual to the counsellor. I think that's something about that it isn't this set framework of saying you have to do this, this, and this in this way. So one of the biggest learnings for me and my person-centered practice is actually what that is Chris being a person-centered counsellor, and that is my practice. And I could have someone else doing person-centered practice which would actually look quite different, but is grounded in the same philosophy. And so I think it offers something of
but what makes it distinctive as opposed to a different approach? Because then that would be every therapy.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think it is the philosophical belief. I think that's what it is for me, and that is grounded. I think I know I'm repeating myself here, but I think it starts with the actualizing tendency. And I think once we have a belief in the actualizing tendency, and ultimately that people can be trustworthy, self-directing, self-knowing, that then we look to what are the best conditions we can offer for that. And I know I mentioned it before, but I think the idea of counter conditioning is so important in this as well, is that clients are often coming to us with a result of the conditioning that they have faced, and that the person-centered counsellor offers a space where that can be in a sense undone and a more congruent place found. So for me, it's about the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions are central to that belief and what we offer to clients. And I think it's also really grounded in the idea of trust and respect for the individual. And I also agree with what you're saying, that that idea of relationship dialogue is so important in that as well. Because it's like, if that wasn't important, they just go and do it on their own somewhere else. It's like, it is the relationship, it is the dialogue, it is the conditions which I think allows clients to go on that journey in a sense, and to kind of work out who they are often, and why they are like that, and then what they want to do from there.
It sounds like we both very much start from that position of kind of a philosophy of value and respect, because in a sense that's what you're saying the actualizing tendency is that position of value and respect. And then there's maybe where it kind of branches a bit, is that more classically where that takes you is towards the 6 conditions.
Yes, yeah.
And that's the best way of doing that. And I guess pluralistically where it takes you is more towards kind of tailoring it to the individual client, and perhaps a more
Yes.
openness, less of a kind of a, whereas one way is the 6 conditions, the other way is kind of trying to be a bit more open within the bounds of whatever we're trained and skilled in.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I guess that's a kind of ongoing debate really. I mean, we were thinking, Chris, weren't we? We're kind of coming to the end of our time, but we were thinking that we'd be interested in people's responses and reactions to this dialogue.
Yes.
So we'll post it, and the idea is that we'll post it both on our YouTube channels, and then if people want to make comments, and then what do we do after that?
I think maybe we can try and collect some of those, or see if there's themes that are coming up regularly. Maybe see what the bias is like on both of our channels, and just maybe just get a bit of a collection of how people have responded. Maybe questions we haven't addressed that they would like to have seen, questions about what we've responded, and then maybe we can come back and try and answer some areas that we've missed out. I know for myself, I'm sure there'll be afterthoughts and things. One of which I want to go back to is, I think it's a really good point you make about maybe we hold a very, very similar starting philosophical belief, and then what we believe that kind of entails us to do is where there's a bit of a separation there. Is like, okay, maybe we think clients are coming to us in similar positions, but what we offer is maybe where we just separate a little bit. I guess what would be interesting for me in relation to that is, would you see pluralism as person-centred?
That's a very good question, Chris. I'd like to.
Okay.
I mean, I'd like to see, for me, pluralism is an expression of person-centred values. And as a kind of, when we talk about pluralism as a kind of practice, and but also as a values. And for me, I think pluralism expresses what I see as the kind of essence of person-centred values in how we think about therapy as a whole. But I think I don't want to. I wouldn't want it to kind of occlude or stop people, like yourselves and like many people out there who want to practice in what, might be called a more purist, person-centered way, which isn't maybe pluralistic in the sense of bringing other things in. And it's really important for me that people don't feel that pluralism means everybody has to be integrative. It's it's about, for me, it's those person-centered values about celebrating difference, valuing the different things people do. And one of those different things people do is work in brilliantly in-depth person-centered ways, like it sounds like you do. And I think that's fantastic. And I wouldn't in any way be suggesting to you, but you should be doing a bit more CBT. I think it's important that we let people know what we do. Absolutely. And we're clear about that. But there's so much room for difference. So is pluralism person-centered? I wish it was seen as a kind of a person-centered at a meta level, but it's been funny to me. And like I said at the beginning, it's been kind of upsetting why people have been so annoyed about it. I don't really understand it. Maybe it's because people have felt that maybe some of the stuff that we've written has been kind of critical of person-centered purity, and people have responded to that. Maybe that's been it. Maybe there's a threat at some level. I don't know. But I hope part of this dialogue is trying to bridge that, isn't it? And
absolutely
try and find productive ways forward that everyone can grow from.
And again, I think that fits with the theory, is that if people are going to feel kind of attacked in some way, that it can bring out that defensiveness. So I wonder about that, if the kind of some of the pluralism has come via lacking in person-centered therapy, I wonder if that creates some of that coming back. I'm not so sure, because it seems like you're saying it's a surprising reaction, it's a disappointing reaction that you're trying to offer this, and actually it's kind of rubbing people up the wrong way.
I think what upsets me, I think it's something about, in the person-centered approach, it's so much about growing, evolving, developing, actualization. And so, I want to see us as a community growing as well, and actualizing and developing. And that means new ideas and change. And Rogers talks a lot about that, about, sometimes the evidence shows things that you don't like, but being always open to the evidence. And so there's something for me about this kind of very classical you know, kind of 1957, this is, you know, the 6 conditions is the be all and the end all, and it's never going to change. That for me doesn't feel very person-centered. You know, the work, the emotion focused therapists and focusing, and, you know, I do workshop about these tribes, and I love this kind of proliferation. And for me, that feels truly person-centered.
Right.
So I guess my frustration is sometimes feeling like people are just kind of digging their heels in and saying, you know, person-centered was this, it's never going to change, this is the truth. What Roger said was right. And but yeah, no, you're right, Chris. Also, it's a kind of reaction probably to feeling threatened, and probably there's ways in which I have been unhelpfully critical that hasn't helped things. So you know, and what would be interesting, as you say, Chris, would be to hear people's thoughts. Maybe our next dialogue would be with other people as well, and involving other voices and extending the dialogue so that we can all kind of grow together.
Yeah, I had one thing just before we finish that I think would be helpful on the back of that, especially if people are responding, is I know you're asking me about how I see person-centered, and on the back of what you've just said, I guess I'd be curious to hear your take on that as well, of saying that I see that kind of growing as person-centered, you know, to integrate and include other approaches. So yeah, I think it'd be really good to maybe have some clarity on what your understanding or view of being person-centered is.
I'll think on that one, Chris.
All right.
Okay. Very good question. It's been lovely talking to you. I really enjoyed this.
Likewise. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to kind of following that up and seeing what people come back with and continuing it. But yeah, it's been really good to have the time with you.